Hey everyone, and welcome to Module 11. We are nearing the end of the semester, and that's got to be a good feeling. I'm sure you all are ready to wrap things up. We're getting very ready to wrap things up, especially given everything that's going on. So to start, I hope everybody's doing all right. I hope you're managing as well as can be expected right now, and trying to make some time for yourself if that's at all possible. And I say that knowing that I take little time for myself on a day-to-day basis, just because the way life is. But I do hope you're taking some time for yourself. And if you need anything, please do let me know. So this module is not the most upbeat module, but it is a mix of information that I think is incredibly useful and imperative for you to know at this stage in your education around working with individuals from different backgrounds, from who have been historically marginalized, oppressed, again, disability being one aspect of everything, looking at things through the lens of social justice and considering the effects of disability and the impact of disability on women. So I've split things up a little bit here in terms of the lecture and the PowerPoint. I've got the first part of the PowerPoint is focused on social justice issues, second part on women with disabilities, and then the information and content on multiculturalism and counseling and rehab counseling. I've pretty much left just to some of the readings and the lecture notes. So don't disregard the lecture notes just because I'm not talking about it today. I don't like to, overdo it in terms of the cultural aspects part of it, because you get that in every single class, number one, but you are also taking a cultural issues class down the road. So, so there are some articles, specifically the one around hate crimes and disability. And so what we're really looking at is the intersectionality between disability and all these other potential identifying characteristics or ways that people might self-identify. And so intersectionality is a term that was coined a long time ago by Dr. Crenshaw, I believe her name is. Now I'm going to have to look it up. Kimberly Crenshaw. Completely blanked on her first name, Kimberly Crenshaw, who's an amazing professor of law at Harvard, I again believe. And I had thought about posting a lecture from her, but put it up, took it down, put it up, took it down. And it was focused on the intersectionality of all these different isms. Race, well, not isms, but intersectionality of race and culture and religion and disability status and age and intersectionality of all of that. But I felt like it might be a little bit more politically charged than what I would have liked to put up as content for this course. So I encourage you to look her up. She has a great TED Talk, The Urgency of Intersectionality, as well. And so what is meant by intersectionality, and this is kind of going away from anything I put on the PowerPoint slide, but totally ties into both women with disabilities issue and social justice issues. So intersectionality is basically saying, typically when we're studying a population or making assertions about the effects of something, society, whatever it might be, unemployment, things of that nature, we're typically norming it on either like man versus woman, right? And then even within that, if we're looking at women, we're typically speaking about white women. If we're looking at men and we happen to be speaking about African Americans, then we're looking at African American men, and that doesn't necessarily hit the point of view of African American women. And so the intersectionality piece of it is when somebody has a characteristic that they identify with or that society would place on them that is marginalized or historically marginalized, but there might be two identities, right? So somebody might be a woman who is from South America, so, and who may also be, who identifies as lesbian. So then you have all these different identifying characteristics for one individual, and then our minds explode and we say, well, what am I supposed to read to know how to work with this client? Well, you have to understand, and this is where the social justice aspect comes into play in terms of counseling. You have to understand how important it is to start to apply social justice approach to the work that you're doing so that you can pick out which pieces of an individual's identity are one pieces that you need to focus on, maybe more so in terms of what they're dealing with in their overall story? Or, is it that somebody might check some boxes on a piece of paper, but when they verbalize who they might be, it doesn't actually line up with what they've checked on the boxes on the piece of paper. And so the work of people that apply social justice approaches in terms of counseling and really are looking at kind of two things. One, you're identifying inequities that exist. You're acknowledging that that we shouldn't just be limiting our scope of knowledge, expanding our competence to just race, to just religion, to just ethnicity, that we should be broadening our understanding of what it means to be a member of a cultural group, and that some of these things may not be considered cultural, but really are a social justice group, right? A group of individuals that's been systematically oppressed or marginalized, right? Or may be, experiencing some form of bias in our society or in our culture. So one part of that is acknowledging that those things exist, and the other part of it is working to eliminate oppression within, whether it's the work that we're doing, the offices that we're working in, the agencies we're working for, the states that we live in, the country that we live in, and ideally, all the way out to the world, which is a grandiose idea, right? But so again, if we're thinking about how we define social justice in terms of counseling, because I know the term social justice has become politicized at this point in my life, and so I'm not saying that this is not at all socialism. Okay, it's just not. It's social justice counseling, social justice approach as they apply to counseling and the counseling relationship and our therapeutic goals that we share with our clients. So this is not something that's political, although the political stuff, because of people's environments, because of our clients' environment, we again have to acknowledge the political aspects because of the effect and impact that they have on our clients. But that in and of itself, that is understanding, the systemic oppression that somebody might be facing and how that might limit their ability to reach a goal or achieve a goal. So we acknowledge all these things and we're working towards equity. I always like to ask, what does social justice mean to you? Because it means something different to everybody, and especially depending on the area of the United States that you live in. Social justice looks very different in, a highly densely populated urban area compared to a not at all densely populated rural area. And, social justice, being from West Virginia, social justice typically to me looks more like socioeconomic status and inequities within that, and how that can impact access to things like healthcare and mental health access and all of that. So social justice looks a little bit different to everybody, and so it is something to consider. Part of what is consistent in everybody's themes of, when we ask them a group to identify what social justice means to them, whether you're asking people like in nursing or sociology or psychology, social work, counseling, worldview is consistent throughout our understanding of social justice approaches. And so with the worldview, we again, pretty sure I've talked to you about worldview before, but our worldview is shaped from the moment we are born, and in some cases in utero, because the impact of stress on a mother while she's pregnant with the child can actually have long-lasting effects to the child themselves. And that can again impact your worldview. So our worldview and construction of it begins in childhood, and this how we are socialized to understand gender norms. When we go to the stores and we see everything that's pink is for girls and everything that's blue is for boys, and there's no in between. And if you're a boy, God help you if you like pink, and if you're a girl, you definitely can't like orange. So that's a representation of socialization of gender norms, right? So that may look different here in the United States compared to other places. It may look different in West Virginia than it does in California. So all of these things are dependent on how we've grown up, the environment that we were raised in, the people that raised us. And so when we fail to we put the when we put the blinders on to either acknowledge how our worldview was shaped. Number one, that's the first step. We have to examine our own worldview and what that means. And if we put the blinders on to that, then we will never be able to get to the next step, which is to acknowledge the worldview of our clients, and then try to understand how that all fits together in the work that we're going to be doing with them. So we have to be able to acknowledge our worldview, examine it, critically examine it at times, so that we are able to understand and reflect on where our values stem from, our beliefs, and our biases about clients. Now, I understand that you all want to come to me and say you love everybody the same and you just want to help everybody out there. Yeah, that's great. You wouldn't be a counselor or a future counselor if you didn't have that trait, right? But everybody has innate biases against individuals that aren't themselves. It's just the way of humans. And so you have to be able to examine what those are, critically evaluate them, and confront them head on in order to be able to actively work with somebody that doesn't identify in the same way as you. And that examination of behavior is important because our nonverbals speak volumes. It comes out through verbal communication sometimes as well. Our interpretation of assessments, our use of assessments in general, which assessments we might be using or might not be using, and how we have come to understand how people become, how people develop problems, right? Interpretation of discourse, how our clients come to the space where they are, how that has happened to them. Do we feel like certain conditions are a result of, any kind of effect of a higher power, right? Because spirituality is a part of this, and acknowledging clients' worldview and the fact that certain cultures, yes, do still believe that somebody that has schizophrenia has schizophrenia because their family members did something wrong, and a higher power is inflicting something bad, inflicting in quotations mark here, but inflicting something bad on their loved ones. So we have to understand where our interpretation of discourse is, and then at the same time understand where our client's interpretation is. Just to list some just groups, right? So the isms, right? I always call them the isms, individuals that, classifications of individuals that are typically used in our society that may or may not actually mean something in terms of our genetic makeup and our who we actually are as people. But typically when we're thinking about systematic oppression, and on the opposite side of it, privilege, these are the categories that people might see that they are biased towards one side or the other, right? Racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, ableism, of course, the isms. So rehab counseling is unique in that the profession of rehab counseling has always addressed attitudinal and environmental barriers that exist for the clients that we work with. It's just the nature of our job. It's something that we have to do. So rehab counselors have always acknowledged that these barriers are out there, and the work of rehab counselors and part of the advocacy work that's done is to address these barriers head on and change the powers that be and impart some type of systemic change so that the barriers are knocked down for our clients, so they do have access to services. So promoting equality for persons with disabilities, of course, is a huge part of what rehab counseling has always done, trying to get people into employment settings that otherwise would have had a door slammed in their face, advocating for certain laws like the Rehab Act and the ADA to be put into place so that our clients with disabilities can directly be impacted and affected by them. And so all of that comes in the political activism part of it. But when we look at the literature around what rehab counseling, the way that rehab counseling has studied all of this in the context of social justice, really there's not a lot that speaks to rehab counseling and social justice specifically. Research is focused on multicultural competence, advocacy, different ethical considerations, the impact of race. But in terms of rehab counselors collectively coming together and saying, this is how we view social justice issues and competence, there's not been a collective agreement on what that means. Now, the areas of competence that have been social justice and advocacy competencies that have been adopted by the ACA. Of course, rehab counseling and all the subgroups of rehab counselors would agree with that. But, you know, you can see in some other specialty areas that there's been a little bit more discussion about what social justice actually looks like within that profession, and rehab counseling kind of lags behind a little bit. But, you know, the main takeaway from all of this in terms of what you all can and should be considering when you go out and start working with individuals is that the treatment that you're providing, the services that you're providing should be, of course, culturally appropriate. You need to be able to reflect what you do know and what you don't know. You need to be able to broach these topics, even if they might be uncomfortable for you, knowing that if you did not bring them up, they would likely be very uncomfortable for your client. I mean, that's one big thing. You know, if we don't know something about our client's culture, it may be that it's a fleeting moment of discomfort in ourselves to address it, to say, you know what, I really am not familiar with the religion that you say that you identify with. Can you give me some more information about that so I understand? Better to acknowledge it rather than never acknowledge it, and then the client throughout the entire time they're meeting with you, that be something in the back of their mind, them thinking, you know what, this person doesn't know me, they don't understand me, they've not asked any questions, they don't know who I really am, they must not care. So, you know, it's all about us being able to take that on for a minute so we can fully understand our client's worldview. So I'll take a deep breath there and we'll move on to women with disabilities, which isn't taking like a hard left completely, but it is shifting topics a bit. Now, if we were using a traditional textbook for this class, which the class generally does have a textbook that is for this class, but it's specific to rehab counseling, and so the reason that I opted not to use it is because of our dual focus on rehab counseling and clinical mental health counseling, and so I didn't want you to have to purchase two $100 books, so that's why you don't have a textbook. But the traditional Introduction to Rehab Counseling textbook does have an entire chapter on working with women with disabilities in general. Again, not the most uplifting presentation and statistics to put out there for you, but I want you to understand that when you're working with a woman with a disability, that you have to, again, consider the intersectionality of that individual being a woman who also has a disability. And so the strategies and techniques that you might use with any woman may need to be altered and modified because you're working with a woman with a disability, or you may need to ask some of the questions that are important to ask of women with disabilities so that you have a full understanding of their worldview. What is it like for them to be a woman with a disability? What is it like for them personally? And so I actually put some videos up that I don't know, depending on how comfortable or uncomfortable you get with talking about some of these issues, might be a little uncomfortable, but part of what we have to talk about when we're talking about working with women with disabilities is sexuality, sexual identity, access to healthcare, including gynecological healthcare, or lack of access, I should say. And so there are some good YouTube videos on all of that that I hope you do watch. So stats, again, not great. 1 in 4 women with a disability, 1 in 4 women in general with a disability. There are 1 in 4 women in the United States living with a disability, if I could get this out, which is a good amount if you think about it. Historically, women with disabilities, again, speaking about women with disabilities, not just women, although they kind of mirror each other. Women with disabilities tend to have less education, higher rates of unemployment, higher rates of poverty, are paid even less than white women that do not have a disability, women of color who do not have a disability. Then you've got the women with disabilities that are paid, you know, less than white women without a disability who are still not earning you know, $1 to $40 for men, but a different issue completely, right? But my point is here that women with disabilities are not receiving the same level of services and access to education and opportunity in general. The counseling literature does actually offer support for women with disabilities as their own cultural group because of the unique experience that women with disabilities have. And because of their shared experiences among that particular subgroup. Challenges are unique, and there have been these longstanding assumptions that that exist around women with disabilities and working with women with disabilities, specifically in more along the lines in the rehab counseling arena, that, you know, literature kind of speaks to how women with disabilities aren't provided with the same level of career goals as men with disabilities. You know, they're kind of fast-tracked into certain occupations that have long-standing roots of women filling those roles, like educator. So that all exists, again, within the rehab counseling world too. So it's important that we have to acknowledge that, and we have to acknowledge that collectively as a profession, we have to start moving past that. Employment inequities, of course, exist for women with disabilities. Part of this is kind of those external or environmental barriers, access to services, provision of service and how they're being provided, social stereotypes, women that persist today. Women should be staying at home. They should be caring for children. If you're a woman with disability, you definitely should not be in the workforce. You know, who is the guy behind you taking care of you? Access to training, education, internal and personal inequities. You know, again, that what society reflects outwardly about our opinion on women with disabilities, women with themselves that have the disability tend to start to internalize that. And so they might then start to believe that they should not be working or do not have the ability or skill level to work. So in terms of counselor competence, again, I think it's kind of reiteration of what I just said, but you have to be able to critically examine your personal view of women. And this is going to look different for everybody, women included. So, you know, and speaking to all the majority of you that are ladies out there, you know, you have to critically evaluate your view of women as well, you know, so that you are effectively providing counseling to women with disabilities. Advocacy, social justice, all of that can be tied in the work that we're doing with women with disabilities as well. Again, statistics around healthcare inequities, not great. Women with disabilities are more likely to have a number of different conditions. The rates of depression are higher than men with disabilities by a lot, like a good amount, especially for those living in rural areas, which guess what? Majority of you are living in a rural-ish area or have people that you love and care for that are living in a rural area. And so this, I think, speaks to a lot of us that, you know, to see that 75% of 134 women living with a disability in rural areas have higher rates of depression, serious, severe depression as well. Women with disabilities are less likely to be offered routine screening for breast cancer, cervical cancer, access to gynecological services, to women-oriented services in general. Lots of environmental barriers exist if you are a woman or have ever accompanied a woman into a woman's doctor's office, and you start to think, you know, if I were using a mobility device, how would I be able to get into this seat and into this position? You know, there are limitations there that the medical community hasn't exactly, in my opinion, addressed to the fullest extent that they should. Also, of course, facilities should be accessible. That becomes a barrier. And therefore, when the barrier exists, the women are, you know, less likely to go, right? So if you're working with somebody, especially somebody that is younger, within, you know, childbearing years, of course, which that is, you know, a moving a moving range too anymore, of course. But these are topics that you might need to broach with that woman. You know, when was the last time that you saw a doctor? Are you going to regular visits? You know, do you need help or guidance around how that might look? Because that's something that's incredibly important to women, to get the checks and the screenings that we have to get, right? So we might have to, again, touch base with our clients a little bit more specifically if we're working with a woman who has a disability that may not be receiving services, offer consultations, referrals, provide some education on exercise or how to access different facilities, groups that are women specific, working with health insurance companies if needed to advocate for those types of services. Kind of, again, moving on to the sexuality part of it, you know, in society, I think if you're thinking about how society, and well, I'm talking about American society here, how we view women in general, and if you think about women in media, women that are represented on TV. We are just now kind of breaking through that barrier where we're seeing women of color being represented on a larger scale, not again to the on an equal scale, but to a larger extent. But if we're looking at seeing women with disabilities reflected as they should be reflected, still lagging behind. And if you see women with disabilities being represented, it's kind of in more the stereotypical way, right? The crazy woman who's having a psychotic break and needs to be institutionalized. That's how we see women represented out there in media, right? So when it comes to sexuality, it's not like we're seeing women with a disability represented as supermodels or, plastered on the front of Vanity Fair. We're just not really seeing that. So sexuality is something that to a degree is not even considered when we're thinking or considering individuals, women with disabilities. So of course the needs and the desires are the same. They're there, they exist, they always have, they always will. But one of the things that we need to recognize in our work with clients that are women that have a disability is that it might be something that we need to be addressing or talking about or bringing up in any way. Relationships, you're going to bring up relationships with clients, men, women, whatever, whoever. So you are needing to identify where your levels of comfort are, right? Better yet, where your levels of discomfort are in speaking about sexuality and working with women with disabilities. Motherhood, again, I hate to start out this with a couple of bad bullet points, but really there's been a history of sterilization, and it's a current practice even today to just prescribe in women with disabilities, specifically like intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, just with long-term contraceptives without any explanation, any kind of counseling, any kind of anything. And the history of sterilization, of course, in the United States, we've gotten past that. In other parts of the world, we cannot say the same. So there's still kind of this widespread lack of understanding of how a woman with a disability, specifically physical disability, can get pregnant, care for the child, how, the medical community is going to approach that woman whenever it's time for her to go into labor, what to do, how to do it, all of that. It's kind of an area that's not as explored, I think, as it should be. Support is necessary, and it's there. There are a lot of online communities out there that offer support to women with disabilities that are raising children or who are pregnant, any stage in between. And so things that we might need to be considerate of are referring our clients who are women with a disability to appropriate support services if there are any available in the area. Again, and making sure that we are getting them to the right place, especially if somebody's got a physical disability after the fact. They may need to go through some physical or occupational therapy after the baby is born. Yeah, when we move into slide 17 and 18, again, it's not really getting much better here, right? So there's an article that I read, and I believe that I posted it, that has the statistic that 80% of women with disabilities have been sexually assaulted. That is an outstanding number. If you think about how 1 in 4 women in the U.S. have a disability, and then 80% of those women having experienced sexual assault, that it is sombering at best. There's a difference we have to recognize the difference between physical abuse and emotional abuse when we're thinking about women with disabilities. Physical abuse is, what we're thinking of with physical abuse, the actual physical aggressive abuse. Emotional abuse, and the expanded definition of emotional abuse and abuse in general when we're thinking about women with disabilities might be withholding food, withholding care, saying, you have to do this sexual favor for me, or I'm not taking you to your doctor's office, or I'm not taking you to the grocery store. That happens from caregivers, from family members, partners, friends, personal assistants, staff members, all of that. So we have to be aware of if there's a red flag that pops up, if working with a woman with a disability that is explaining to us that, yeah, they'd like to do these certain things, but whoever their caregiver is withholding that or withholds things from them, they just refuse to give them their phone, or they go a week without assisting them with brushing their hair if they need that. All of those things constitute abuse in an abusive relationship, and can come really from anywhere. So as mandated reporters, we might have to report some of those instances. At the very least, we can provide some education to clients if and when needed, and screening, of course, asking the right questions, directed questions if we feel like there's some type of abuse going on. Sometimes we may be one of the only people that a woman with a disability has the chance to talk to about some of this stuff, and they may not be opening up to us in the way that is very clear, that shows, yeah, our client's being abused, and they're being very concrete about it. So it is all about us asking those directed questions, probing for information, trying to get a better understanding of what that client's relationship is with other people outside of that office. Because again, if somebody's coming in for counseling and they have that one-on-one time with somebody, that might be some of the only one-on-one time that woman gets in her day, right? Or her week, or her, month, depending on how many times that client comes to see you. So, that might be a space where she can share a little bit more, and a space where you can pick up on some of those red flags that could be helpful to the client, right? So I do want you to kind of leave this lecture, albeit very long, but long for me, thinking about what social justice looks like to you, how you could see yourself kind of incorporating social justice into the work that you do, how you might need to address some of these issues within the client populations that you hope to work with, what this might look like for the client population you're working with or you see yourself working with, or potentially, other activities that you might that might be beneficial for you kind of moving forward as you continue to build competence in all of these areas: social justice and multicultural counseling, working with women, working with individuals from marginalized and oppressed populations. So, all right, with that, I will leave you to the rest of the work and the readings, and I hope you enjoy the videos, and check back with you in the discussion board.